There is a document sitting inside the royal household right now that Camilla has read exactly once. She is not asked to read it again. People who were near her in the hours after it was placed in front of her describe a woman who went completely still in a way that is different from composure. Composure is something you put on. What happened to Camilla in that room was something being taken off. The document was not a letter, it was not a message from William or a note passed through an aide. It was a legal instrument, properly drawn, properly witnessed, and properly filed, transferring ownership of Princess Diana's pearl set to Princess Charlotte. And by the time Camilla saw it, there was not a single thing left on earth she could do about it. Before you can understand what that document did to her, you have to understand what those pearls actually were, not what they are worth, not what they look like in a photograph, what they meant, and what it cost Diana to wear them, and what it cost the people around her when she stopped being alive to wear them herself. Diana received the pearl set in the early 1980s. The exact occasion has been the subject of quiet disagreement among royal historians for years, which is itself a detail worth sitting with, because when something is valuable enough, the story of where it came from becomes almost as contested as the object itself. What is not in dispute is what the set consisted of: a multi-strand pearl necklace, a matching bracelet, and a pair of drop earrings. Not flashy in the way some crown jewelry is flashy. Not the kind of thing that dominates a room before the person wearing it has said a single word. The pearl set was elegant in the specific way that Diana herself was elegant, which is to say it looked simple and was not simple at all, and it made everything around it look slightly less considered than it was. She wore it at a number of significant public occasions through the 80s and into the 90s. There are photographs of her in it that most people who followed that period of the monarchy would recognize immediately without being able to name precisely what they are looking at. That is the specific quality those pieces had. They were present at the moments that mattered without ever pulling focus from the woman wearing them. Diana loved them in the way she loved anything that felt genuinely hers rather than borrowed from an institution. She had strong feelings about which pieces of jewelry belonged to the crown and which belonged to her, and she was precise about the distinction in a way that the household around her found inconvenient, but never successfully challenged during her lifetime. The pearl set, by every account she ever gave on the subject, was hers. Not on loan, not held in trust, hers. When she died in Paris in August of 1997, the pearl set was among her personal effects. It entered the complicated limbo that follows when a woman of her position dies without the protection of anyone inside the institution who has both the power and the inclination to make sure her things stay her things. And that limbo, as it turned out, lasted for a very long time. There is a pattern to what happened to Diana's personal belongings inside the royal household after her death. And it is the kind of pattern that only becomes visible when you stand far enough back to see the whole shape of it. Any single piece of it, taken alone, looks like administration. Estates get managed, items get cataloged, things get moved into storage while decisions are being made. That is how every large household in the world works, and there is nothing sinister about any individual step. The sinister part is the direction. Every single step went the same way. Camilla did not arrive in those houses and immediately begin opening drawers. That is not how she operates, and it never has been. The thing that made her effective inside that institution for decades is the same thing that made her dangerous to Diana while Diana was alive. She is patient. She understands that the person who waits for the right moment and then moves quietly tends to end up with more than the person who announces what they want. Royal insiders have spoken for years about the way Diana's jewelry legacy was handled in the period after her death and before Camilla's formal elevation. Pieces that had been clearly identified as Diana's private property moved into household storage under descriptions that made their origin less obvious. Cataloging language that had been precise while Diana was alive became, after she died, considerably more general. A specific necklace became jewelry, pearl, and multi-strand. A bracelet with a documented history became bracelet pearl, provenance under review, provenance under review. Think about what that phrase does. It takes a settled question and reopens it, and once a question is open, it can be answered in whatever direction the person controlling the archive decides to answer it. The pearl set moved through this process in the years following Diana's death. It was not stolen. Nothing so crude ever happens in a place that runs on the written word and the unspoken understanding. It was absorbed. Gradually, through a series of steps that each had a reasonable explanation on its own, it moved from being clearly Diana's into a category that was considerably less clear. And then, once the category was sufficiently murky, it moved again, into active use, by a woman who had been waiting, in one form or another, since 1973 for the world inside those walls to reorganize itself around her preferences. William watched every step of it. He watched it, and he said nothing, and he filed every single detail away, in the place where he keeps the things he intends to act on when the moment is right. That place, by every account of the man, has considerable capacity and a very long memory. He was 15 years old when his mother died. You know that already if you have followed this family at all. You know about the dark suit and the walk through London, and the face that did not move while the whole world watched it for any sign of breaking. What people talk about less is what he already knew by that point about what had been done to his mother while she was alive. Diana told him things. She told him because she believed, and the evidence suggests she was right to believe, that the boy who was going to grow up to run this institution deserved to understand what the institution had done to the people inside it. She told him about the affair. She told him about the 3 people in the marriage. She told him, in the careful language of a mother trying to be honest without being cruel, that the woman his father had chosen over her was not someone who had wandered into the situation by accident, and then she died. And William turned 15 in a world where everything that had been his mother's was suddenly subject to other people's decisions. The possessions were the part that cut him in a specific way. There is something about a person's things that carries them forward after they are gone. The way a piece of jewelry sits in a box and holds something of the person who wore it. The way a room smells different when the person who lived in it is no longer living. Diana's things were everywhere in the early days after her death, still exactly where she had left them, still carrying the ordinary evidence of a person who had not known she was about to stop existing. And then, slowly and then faster, they stopped being everywhere. William was 16 when he told someone close to him that Camilla had gotten her claws into his father and never once let go. Those words have been reported. They have never been denied by anyone who was there. And underneath them was something more specific than grief or even anger. It was the particular fury of a boy who understood exactly what he was watching and had no power yet to stop it. The jewelry was part of what he was watching. He saw pieces that had been clearly his mother's enter a household accounting system that treated their origin as a matter for future determination. He saw the pearl set specifically, pieces he had watched his mother wear at occasions he could still place precisely in his memory, move through that system, and eventually stop appearing in the documentation under her name at all. He was not yet in a position to do anything about it. He understood, with the clarity of someone who had been learning how this institution works since before he could read, that the moment was not yet right. He waited. He became a man. He took on the duchy. He learned how the legal architecture of royal property actually functions. Not the version of it that gets explained at charity dinners, but the version that matters when there is a dispute over who owns something and why. And he started asking questions, quietly and through the right channels, about exactly where the line falls between crown jewelry, household property, and private personal effects belonging to a specific individual. He asked those questions over a period of years. He asked them in ways that did not announce what he was building, and the answers he got, piece by piece, assembled themselves into something that the people who gave him those answers individually had no idea they were helping construct. The legal distinction at the heart of what William eventually built is one that most people who follow the royal family have never had reason to think about carefully. Crown jewelry is held in trust for the monarch. It belongs, in a real and formal sense, to the institution rather than to any individual. A queen consort can wear it. A future queen can wear it. But it cannot be given away, transferred, or bequeathed to a specific person as private property. It exists in perpetuity as part of the crown's holdings, and the crown decides its fate. Private jewelry is an entirely different matter. Pieces purchased privately, received as private gifts, or clearly documented as personal property rather than institutional holdings, belong to the individual who owns them. They can be left in a will. They can be transferred during a lifetime. They can be given to a daughter, or, in this case, a granddaughter, through a process that has nothing to do with what the household thinks about it, or what any future queen consort might prefer. The pearl set sat in a gray area that had been deliberately constructed to keep it there. Pieces that had once been clearly documented as Diana's private property had, through years of careful recataloguing, been moved into a category that made their status ambiguous enough to resist challenge. The household had gotten very good over a long period at making the murky look like it had always been murky. What William's legal team did, working carefully and without publicity over several years, was go back through the original documentation, not the cataloging that happened after Diana's death. The documentation that existed while she was alive, the gift records, the purchase receipts, the insurance documents she had maintained herself on her personal property, the letters in her own handwriting in which she referred to specific pieces as mine, not the family's, mine. The pearl set appeared in that documentation with a clarity that the later recataloguing had tried very hard to obscure. It had been received as a private gift. It had been insured under Diana's personal policy rather than the household's. She had referred to it in at least 2 written communications as among her personal pieces. And she had included it in an informal document, not a formal will, but a handwritten note discovered among her private papers, in which she expressed her wishes about which of her things should go to her sons and which to any daughters they might one day have. That note was the foundation of everything William built on top of it, because it was not just sentiment. In the hands of the right legal team, working with the right documentation of the pearl set's original status as private property, it became the basis for a formal transfer of ownership, one that could be executed, one that could be properly witnessed and properly filed, one that could be handed to a woman who believed those pearls were hers and watched her understand, in real time, that they had never been hers at all. Charlotte. The choice of her specifically is the part of this story that tells you the most about how William thinks and what he was actually trying to do beyond the immediate reckoning. He could have transferred the pearl set to himself. He is Diana's son. His claim is direct and obvious and would have been legally supportable. He did not do that. He could have transferred it to Catherine, who has by now become the public face of Diana's legacy in the way that only time and genuine grace can produce. That transfer would have made its own statement and would have been impossible to challenge. He did not do that either. He chose Charlotte. He chose his daughter. He chose a girl who was growing up inside the same institution that erased her grandmother from its walls, that put her grandmother's portrait in a storage room and kept it there for 25 years, that absorbed her grandmother's private belongings into a system designed to make their origin difficult to trace. A girl who will one day walk through that institution as a senior royal woman and who will, on that day, be wearing her grandmother's pearls. Think about the specific weight of that choice. Diana never got to meet Charlotte. She died in 1997 and Charlotte was not born until 2015. There is an 18-year gap between them that nothing can close. What William did with this transfer is the closest thing available to bridging it. He took something Diana wore at the moments that mattered and placed it legally, formally, and permanently in the hands of the daughter Diana never got to hold. The emotional logic of it is clear enough, but the institutional logic is what makes it irreversible. Charlotte is a minor. The transfer was structured under legal provisions that govern the holding of assets on behalf of minors within the royal household. What that means in practice is that the pearl set is not simply Charlotte's in the way that a birthday gift is a child's. It is held formally in her name, under a legal framework that has nothing to do with whoever happens to be king or queen at any given moment, and everything to do with Charlotte's personal inheritance from her grandmother. Camilla cannot touch it. Charles cannot reverse it without initiating a legal process that would require him to argue, formally and on the record, that Diana's private property was not Diana's private property. And the documentation William assembled makes that argument essentially impossible to sustain. He did not leave a single door open. He never does. Princess Anne knew. That is the piece of this that matters before you get to the night itself, because Anne's involvement was not incidental, and it was not passive, and she did not simply receive a phone call afterwards and give her blessing from a distance. She was part of the construction of it, not the legal architecture, which was William's work and his team's work over years, but the earlier part, the documentation part, because Anne was in that family before Diana arrived, and she was there through the whole arc of it. She attended occasions at which Diana wore the pearl set. She was present at family events where Diana's private jewelry was discussed as Diana's private jewelry, without ambiguity and without any need for recataloguing, because Diana was still alive and nobody was yet trying to move anything. Anne's memory of those occasions and her willingness to set it down in a formal witness statement as part of the legal process was one of the pieces that made the original documentation stronger than it would otherwise have been. She remembered. She had always remembered. And she was prepared when the moment came to say so in a form that carried legal weight. The night before the documentation was finalized and filed, William called her. The calls between these two tend to be short, because neither of them requires a long conversation to understand what the other one means. She told him she was glad it had finally happened. She told him it was right. She told him that Diana had always known those pearls were going to outlast the people who tried to take them from her. William said he thought so too. The call ended. Two people in two different buildings, both of whom have spent their entire adult lives keeping the longest possible game, completing in about 90 seconds a conversation that 25 years of patience had been building toward. Then William put the phone down and the documentation went to be filed, and the piece that had been sitting at the center of his plan for longer than most people would have the discipline to hold a plan together was finally, formally, legally done. Camilla had no idea. She had spent years believing the pearl set was simply part of the household now, absorbed into the collection of things that filled the residences, and moved with the institution rather than with any individual. She had worn pieces of Diana's jewelry, not the pearl set, which had remained technically in storage through the cataloging process, but other pieces, in public, in photographs, at occasions where the choice carried a meaning that everyone in that family understood and nobody said out loud. She had believed she was winning. By every visible measure, she had been winning. And she had absolutely no warning that the ground underneath that belief had been quietly excavated for years. The document reached Camilla on a Tuesday morning. That specific detail matters because it was not accidental. Nothing in the sequence William designed was accidental. Tuesday mornings at that residence have a particular rhythm. Staff briefings, schedule reviews, the working start to a working week. Camilla would have been in a certain frame of mind, organized, forward-facing, moving through the machinery of her role with the confidence of a woman who had spent 30 years learning how that machinery works and making it work for her. The document came through official channels. That is the part she had no defense against. It did not arrive as a confrontation or a declaration or anything she could have characterized as an attack. It arrived as paperwork, formal, correctly routed, carrying all the right signatures and all the right reference numbers. The kind of document a royal household processes dozens of times a year in connection with estates, trusts, and the management of personal assets. She would have picked it up the way you pick up something you are expecting to be routine, and then she would have started reading it. The people who were near her in that room in the minutes that followed describe what happened with a consistency that suggests they were all watching the same thing, which they were, because none of them knew it was coming either. She went still. Not the stillness of someone receiving bad news and deciding how to respond to it. Something more fundamental than that. The stillness of someone whose entire model of the situation has just been replaced without warning by a completely different one. One member of staff described it as watching a person trying to find the floor after the floor had moved. Another said she set the document down very carefully, as though it were breakable, and then she looked at it without picking it up again for almost a full minute. Then she stood up and walked out of the room. She did not collapse in the literal sense, but what happened to her in that room was a kind of collapse that is harder to recover from than the physical kind. The architecture of a belief she had built over 25 years simply gave way beneath her. She had believed the pearls were absorbed. She had believed Diana's private legacy was manageable. She had believed that time and patience and proximity to power would eventually settle every outstanding question in her favor. The document told her that while she had been believing all of that, someone else had been spending the same 25 years building something she could not undo. She went to Charles. Of course she went to Charles. That has always been the move when the walls close in, because for 30 years, Charles has been the one constant in her position inside that institution. The one person whose loyalty to her has survived everything the country threw at it, everything the family threw at it, everything she herself occasionally threw at it by making the kinds of decisions that required him to defend her in rooms where defending her was not comfortable. She found him and she told him what the document said, and she waited. His silence, when it came, was a different silence from the one he had offered when Diana's portrait went back on the wall. That silence had been the silence of a king accepting a reckoning he could see coming and choosing not to fight it. This one was something else, something quieter, and in some ways more devastating, because this time there was genuine pain in it. Not for Camilla, or not only for Camilla, for himself, for the woman the document was ultimately about, for the 25 years sitting between a mother who had insisted those pearls were hers and a granddaughter who was now going to grow up wearing them. He had known about the pearl set. He had known its history and Diana's feelings about it. He had known, in the way you know things you have been carrying long enough that they stop feeling like facts and start feeling like weather. That the way it had been absorbed into the household after her death was not something Diana would have accepted if she had lived. He had known, and he had allowed it. Because allowing things was, for a long time, the path of least resistance, and Charles has always had a complicated relationship with resistance. Now, his son had gone back through 25 years of allowing and undone the most significant part of it, and Charles sat with that. He told Camilla that the documentation was properly drawn. He told her that William had followed every correct procedure. He told her that the legal basis for challenging the transfer was essentially non-existent, given the original documentation William had assembled. And then he said the thing that will have landed on her harder than any of the rest of it. He said Diana would have wanted it this way. That sentence, in that room, from that man. After everything. There is no answer to it. There is no position from which Camilla could have responded to it that would not have made the situation worse for her. Because if she agreed, she was conceding the entire argument. And if she disagreed, she was arguing with the king about what his dead wife would have wanted in a conversation about a piece of jewelry that the documentation proved had been Diana's all along. She left the room without another word, and Charles sat alone with the choice his son had made and the one he himself had made by not fighting it. And something in the way he sat there, by every account of the people who saw him in that period, suggested that he was not entirely sorry. What William had accomplished was not simply the transfer of one piece of jewelry. That is the part that the people inside that institution understood immediately, and the rest of the world will take longer to catch up with. The pearl set was the test case. That is how these things work when they are built by someone who understands institutions the way William understands them. You do not start with the biggest claim. You start with the one that is cleanest, the one where the documentation is strongest and the legal architecture is most airtight and the emotional case is most undeniable. You win that one completely and correctly and publicly enough that everyone watching understands what just happened. And then, the question hanging in the air over everything that follows is, which piece of Diana's private legacy is next? Because the pearl set was not the only piece that went through the recataloguing process. It was not the only item that moved from clearly documented private property into a gray area of provenance under review. William's legal team spent years going through the original documentation. They found the pearl set, they found its paper trail, and they found other paper trails sitting alongside it in the same archive, waiting for the same process to be applied to them. Camilla understood that in the hours after the document arrived. That is the other part of what emptied her face in that room. It was not just what the document said, it was what it implied about everything that came after it. The pearl set was William telling her that he had gone back through 25 years of what had been done to his mother's belongings and built a legal case strong enough to start reversing it. And he had done it so carefully and so thoroughly that she had not known it was happening until it was finished. The household felt the shift within days. This is the way these things travel through an institution that runs on proximity to power and the reading of signals. Nobody issued a statement, nobody sent a memo, but the people who work in those buildings are professionals at understanding which way the wind is moving, and the wind had moved in a direction that everybody could feel and nobody needed to have explained to them. Diana's name started appearing differently inside official household communications. Not more frequently, though it did appear more frequently. Differently, with a weight and a specificity that had not been there before. References to her private collection, references to her documented wishes, references to the legal framework that William had now established existed and was being properly applied. The language was institutional and careful, and to anyone who knew how to read it, it was a map of what was coming. Camilla's team went quiet in a way that was louder than anything they could have said. Her advisors, people who had spent years being very good at finding angles and exits and the particular kind of language that makes a difficult situation look like a managed one, had nothing to offer this time. There is no angle on a legally airtight transfer of documented private property. There is no exit from a situation where the other person has the original receipts and you have a cataloging decision made by a household official 20 years ago that was designed, however carefully, to obscure what was already clear. She had won the rooms, she had won the walls, she had believed she had won the things, and William had spent a quarter of a century going through the documentation to prove that she had not won any of it, because the things had never actually been available to be won. Catherine told Charlotte on a Wednesday evening, not in a formal setting, not with any ceremony or preparation, the way Diana would have done it, and the way Catherine has always understood instinctively is the right way to do the things that matter most. She told her in the ordinary run of an ordinary evening, the kind that involves dinner and homework and the specific negotiations that govern the end of a school day for 3 children with very different opinions about when bedtime should be. Charlotte was 11 years old. She is, by every account of the people who spend time around her, a girl who has been paying attention since before anyone expected her to be paying attention. She has Diana's quality of being fully present in a room and making every person in it feel that presence without quite being able to explain afterward how she managed it. She is sharper than anyone who does not know her tends to expect, and she absorbs things whole. Catherine showed her a photograph first. Diana wearing the pearl set at an occasion in the 1980s, standing in the particular way Diana stood, which always looked effortless and was never effortless. Charlotte looked at the photograph for a while. Then she looked up at her mother. Catherine told her that those pearls had belonged to her grandmother, that Diana had loved them and worn them at the moments that mattered to her, that Diana had written, in her own words, that she hoped they would find their way to a daughter someday, and that William, Charlotte's father, had spent years making sure they could. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She is the kind of person whose silence means she is thinking rather than the kind whose silence means she is lost. And Catherine has learned over 11 years to tell the difference and wait in it. Then Charlotte said she wished she could have met her. 4 words from a girl sitting at a kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, talking about a woman she knows from photographs and stories, and the particular way the whole world changes tone when her name comes up. That sentence lands somewhere that no legal document can reach, because the legal document is about property, and what Charlotte said was about something else entirely. Catherine said that Diana would have loved her, and she said it in the specific tone that means it is true rather than the tone that means it is kind. And Charlotte heard the difference the same way she hears every difference. The pearl set is being held formally until Charlotte is of age. It will not sit in a storage room while it waits. It is documented, attributed, and accounted for in Diana's name and in Charlotte's name simultaneously. The long gap between grandmother and granddaughter, the 18 years that nothing can close, has been narrowed by the one thing capable of narrowing it, an object that carries a person forward into time they did not live to see. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London. He walked with his face still and his shoulders straight and the whole world watching him do it. And inside whatever was happening to him in that walk, underneath the military bearing his family had raised him to produce in public, regardless of what was happening in private, something was forming. Not a plan yet because he was 15, and grief does not build plans in 15-year-olds. Something earlier than a plan, a direction. He had watched his mother be reduced by the institution she had given herself to. He had watched her be pushed to the edges of it while it still used her face and her warmth and her unique ability to make a person in a hospital bed feel like the only person in the room. He had watched her private things become institutional things after her death, and then watched those institutional things drift, by degrees and by design, toward the woman who had spent 30 years waiting for them. And he had decided, in the way that people who are going to be very effective at something tend to decide it, not loudly, not all at once, but with the specific quiet certainty of someone who has understood a situation completely and intends to do something about it at the right moment. He decided that he was going to put it right, not in the way his brother eventually chose, which was to say all of it at once and let the explosion land where it landed, in the way that is harder and rarer and more permanent. Piece by piece, document by document, legal instrument by legal instrument, until the erasure his mother had been subjected to was reversed so thoroughly and so correctly that nothing about it could be undone. The portrait went back on the wall. Diana's patronages came back into the light. The pearl set came home, not to a storage room, not to a catalog entry in a household archive, but to a girl with her grandmother's eyes sitting at a kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, learning for the first time that someone had loved her before she was born and had trusted. At the end of a life that did not last long enough, that the things she loved would find their way to her someday. Camilla still holds her title. She still walks beside Charles at the occasions that require it. She still occupies the rooms she spent decades positioning herself to occupy. But the collection of Diana's private things that she believed she had absorbed into the permanent furniture of her life is being undone around her, one legally airtight transfer at a time, by a man who has not forgotten a single detail of how any of it happened and who has the patience and the documentation to keep going for as long as it takes. Diana could not protect her own things while she was alive. The institution she was part of was too large and too practiced at the quiet movement of inconvenient facts to allow her to hold everything she wanted to hold. Her son is protecting them now, with interest, and the woman who believed she had won the rooms and the walls and the things is walking past a portrait she cannot take down, toward a future that is going to be defined entirely by how much the man who holds every document decides to give, and how much he decides to take back. And he has already shown her, clearly enough that there is no misreading it, which direction he intends to keep going. Charlotte will wear those pearls one day, at an occasion that matters, in the particular way that the women in that